In the heart of ancient Athens, behind the marble temples and the echoing debates of philosophers, there existed another world, a darker one where human life was traded for the price of a meal. In the city's cramped brothels, a night with a woman could cost no more than 2 barley flour, or even less than a jug of cheap wine. These women, known as porni, lived at the lowest rung of society, reduced to little more than bodies for sale and objects of ridicule. Court records and speeches by men like Dio and Lysias speak casually of them, describing how these women served 6 to 10 men each day, earning barely enough to buy a handful of lentils. Their suffering filled the pockets of brothel owners, who in turn paid taxes to the city, turning exploitation into official business. Athenian law placed no age limit on prostitution. Archaeological evidence reveals that some girls were no older than 10 or 11 when they were first forced into the trade. Each enslaved child was branded with a hot iron on her thigh, a permanent mark declaring her as property. Life in those dimly lit rooms was not simply harsh, it was inhuman. Refusal was not an option. Any girl who resisted was beaten publicly, starved for days, or subjected to punishments so cruel they defy belief. When a new girl arrived, a ritual awaited her, an initiation that destroyed her spirit before her life had even begun. Ancient accounts tell of how she would be assaulted in front of other women and regular patrons, her cries met with laughter and drunken cheers. A man named Pappy of Thessaly once wrote that this humiliation was deliberate to break her will and erase the thought of escape. In this world, innocence had value only in its destruction. Men paid 10 times the usual price for the first night with a girl untouched by previous violence, treating her like a novelty item rather than a human being. Privacy did not exist. Women were forced to work in corners, separated only by dirty cloths, where every cry of pain became part of the brothel's music, mingling with laughter, wine, and the clatter of coins. The owners categorized these women as if sorting livestock by skin color, size, and obedience. There were those labeled unbroken, those who could not speak, those who resisted, and those too afraid to fight. Each label came with a different price. The cruelest customers paid extra to harm. Ancient graffiti and surviving texts describe men who paid more for the pleasure of inflicting pain, slashing faces, breaking teeth, or burning skin with spilled oil. The screams of women became a kind of twisted entertainment. Their agony turned into a drunken melody. In the same city that produced Socrates and celebrated beauty in sculpture, violence against women had become one of the most profitable trades. But even the daily horrors paled in comparison to what occurred during the religious festival, when cruelty was cloaked as sacred ritual. During the festival of Dionysia, for instance, prostitutes were offered freely to groups of men as part of supposed worship. Surviving records describe these events with chilling normalcy: crowds of intoxicated men assaulting women while music played, and bets were placed on how long a victim could endure. On these nights, wine and blood mingled on temple floors. Priests claimed such acts pleased the gods, that the pain of women was an offering for good harvests. The irony was unbearable. In a city that praised wisdom and reason, barbarity was celebrated as divine duty. Those who survived the night were dragged back to the brothels, bleeding and broken, to resume their work. The dead were carried outside the city walls and discarded like trash in ravines, their bodies left to rot in silence. Violence was not hidden, it was woven into the rhythm of Athenian life. Women were routinely beaten with sticks, leather straps, or bare fists for the smallest mistakes. Spilling a drop of wine, speaking without permission, or crying in front of a customer. Some punishments were designed to be psychological torture. A disobedient woman might be locked for days in a pitch-black room without food or water, or tied to a post in the courtyard, left to shiver through cold night or burn beneath the summer sun. Owners mockingly called it character correction. Anything at handicap, a club, a blunt knife could become an instrument of discipline. Over time, the women learned to mask their pain, to smile while dying inside, because tears only brought more blows. The irony was cruel beyond measure. In a city that worshipped the perfection of the human body, these women's bodies became living canvases of scars, bruises, and burns. When one tried to escape, the law sided with her oppressor. A runaway was accused not of seeking freedom, but of stealing property herself. Punishments for such theft were vicious and public. Some were branded again, this time on the forehead or chest with hot metal, marking them as deserters forever. Others were nailed to wooden boards and left in the marketplace as warnings, their slow deaths a spectacle. A few desperate women fled to temples, hoping the gods would show mercy. But priests, easily bribed, returned them to their masters for a fee. Bloodstains on temple steps were washed away by slaves before sunrise, ensuring no trace of guilt remained. Athens had perfected the art of breaking a woman's body without killing her because a living slave was worth more than a dead one. Yet, even that value was fleeting. Medical writings from the era revealed that few survived beyond their disease, infection, exhaustion, and starvation consumed them long before age did. When wounds festered or the body stank of decay, they were forced to keep working until they collapsed. Owners refused medical help. It was cheaper to buy another girl. Complaints from customers about the stench of blood or rotting flesh were met not with pity, but with beatings. Archaeological discoveries near ancient brothels confirmed this horror. Skeletons of young women bearing cracked skulls, broken ribs, deformed spines, and shattered pelvises, a mute testimony carved in bone. Pregnancy in these brothels was never viewed as a natural part of life. It was seen as damage to an owner as property, an interruption to profit. The punishment was immediate and merciless. To prevent births, owners forced women to drink poisonous brews or made them lift unbearable weights until their bodies gave way. Some were struck in the stomach until they bled, while others were forced to swallow mixtures of herbs that caused unbearable pain and violent illness. Ancient medical notes describe even darker methods: boiling oil poured into the womb, sharpened sticks used to tear the unborn from inside. If, despite all this, the pregnancy continued, the woman was made to give birth on the same filthy straw mat where men had violated her moments before. There were no midwives, no clean water, no mercy. She screamed, alone, while other women were forced to keep working, pretending not to hear. Many bled to death. Others succumbed to fever within days. For the brothel owner, it made little difference. A dead woman could be replaced within hours. Archaeologists have uncovered the bones of infants thrown into drains and rubbish pits behind ancient brothel skeletons, discarded like broken pottery. Newborns were often killed immediately after birth, especially girls or children fathered by slaves. For some mothers, ending their child's life was not cruelty but mercy, a final act of love to spare them from the same fate. Under Athenian law, these women did not even exist as people. They had no right to property, no right to refuse, no right to justice. Their bodies and labor were owned entirely by their masters. Many were forced to work under fabricated debts, charges for food, clothing, or shelter that grew every day, ensuring they could never buy their freedom. Refusing a client, even one known for sadism, was impossible. Consent was not a concept. The law denied its existence. A slave's testimony carried no weight unless she was tortured first to prove her truthfulness. So even when a woman dared to speak out, her voice was broken before it reached the courts. Athens, the cradle of democracy, had built its ideals on the exclusion of half its people. Women were denied citizenship, speech, and choice, and the enslaved were not even counted as human beings. While orators praised freedom in the public square, thousands of women lived and died in silence behind locked doors. Sometimes, by sheer chance or the favor of a powerful man, a woman might climb slightly above the pit. A wealthy patron could buy her freedom, or an owner might discover she could sing or dance and train her for elite gatherings. For a moment her life might seem better: silk instead of rags, perfume instead of sweat, a private room instead of a crowded floor. But these luxuries were illusions. They called such women favorites, yet even they lived in chains of gold. Their comfort depended entirely on a man's whim. A single act of disobedience could send them back to the common brothel, or worse. Many were loaned to visiting guests like prized possessions offered as gestures of hospitality, used, then returned. To refuse was unthinkable. Even at the highest rank of this cruel hierarchy, a woman was still a commodity, her worth measured in coin, her freedom an illusion that vanished the moment she was no longer desirable. Age, too, was an enemy. Beauty faded quickly in such conditions, and when youth left a woman's face, so did her value. Those who grew sick or too weak to work were discarded without ceremony, carried beyond the city walls, and left to die, whether they still breathed or not. Archaeological digs near Athens have found women's remains mixed with broken pottery, their final resting places, unmarked and forgotten. They were denied proper burial, denied even a name. In a culture obsessed with commemorating heroes in marble and verse, these women vanished into the earth without a trace. Their lives ended as cheaply as they had been sold. The city that sang of virtue and beauty had no song for them, and yet, in death as in life, their silence was enforced. Comedy playwrights such as Aristophanes mocked prostitutes on stage, turning their pain into punchlines. The audience laughed as actors mimed beatings and assaults. Their humiliations served as entertainment. The very society that celebrated tragedy as high art found humor in the real suffering of women. At home, wealthy men drank from painted cups, depicting scenes of violence, women being bound, beaten, or pursued. These images decorated dining rooms and temples alike, normalizing brutality until it blended into daily life. To the Athenian mind, it was art, not atrocity. The pain of women became decoration for their comfort. Even poets, who immortalized love and beauty in verse, portrayed brothel women as crude, lustful, or deserving of their fate. Their tears became metaphors. Their screams turned into poetic devices. The suffering that should have inspired compassion instead became aesthetic. The city of philosophers learned to rationalize cruelty so well that it ceased to recognize it as cruelty at all. Athens built its democracy on public debate, but no one debated the worth of these women. Their existence was necessary for the city's pleasure, their exploitation a quiet cornerstone of its economy. While Socrates discussed virtue and justice, just a few streets away, women were being whipped and branded. While Pericles praised Athens as the light of civilization, its treasury grew rich on the taxes of brothels and the sale of human flesh. The marble of its temples gleamed white in the sun, but beneath that perfection lay the blood of thousands who were never allowed to speak. For the city that celebrated freedom, these women were its hidden prisoners. For the city that built monuments to beauty, they were its discarded shadows. For the culture that gave birth to theater, philosophy, and democracy, their voices were erased before they could be heard. They were ghosts while alive, forgotten when dead, their stories buried beneath centuries of silence. As the centuries passed, Athens' brilliance was carved deeper into the world's memory. Its poets praised, its philosophers immortalized, its architecture studied and admired. Yet in that glow of greatness, the shadows of those forgotten women still lingered, unseen but never gone. The grandeur of the Parthenon, the beauty of marble statues, the ideals of justice and intellect, all were built on the suffering of people whose names were deliberately erased. The women who had bled in the dark corners of the city, woe or soul branded and broken, were never granted the dignity of remembrance. They became the invisible scaffolding of a civilization celebrated for its light. The taxes collected from brothels helped fund festivals and temples, the very institutions that honored gods indifferent to the cries of those sacrificed in their name. It is easy to speak of Athens as the birthplace of democracy and reason, but its democracy was selective, its reason heartless. The freedom that philosophers boasted of existed only for men of status. Everyone else lived under the weight of their privilege. For the women enslaved in brothels, freedom was not even a dream, it was a dangerous thought, one beaten out of them long before they could speak it aloud. They learned to survive in silence, to turn numbness into armor, to find fragments of humanity in each other's company. When one fell ill, the others quietly shared food, whispered comfort in the dark, or tried to wipe the blood from her face before the next man came. Those small gestures of compassion unrecorded, unseen, were the only rebellion left to them. But Athens did not record such moments. Its historians chronicled wars, kings, and speeches, but not the lives of the women who endured its cruelty. Even in death, their erasure continued. Their bodies were dumped in ravines, with refuse and animal bones, denied the sacred burial rites that every Athenian citizen was promised. No songs were sung for them. No family mourned their passing. No gravestones bore their names. They became part of the earth, their bones mixing with broken pottery, fragments of everyday life discarded without a thought. For centuries, no one spoke their stories, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one cared to listen. The city that gave humanity philosophy also perfected the art of forgetting. The poets wrote of gods and heroes, yet never of the women whose suffering helped sustain the very society they glorified. Even the word porn, from which pornography would later derive, carried within it the echo of their degradational linguistic scar that has outlived their flesh. Archaeologists, centuries later, would unearth what Athens had tried to hide. Beneath layers of soil, the evidence spoke louder than any ancient text. Bones marked by violence, teeth shattered, hips disfigured by endless violation, skulls bearing the healed cracks of repeated blows. In drainage channels behind old brothel sites, the remains of infants told of lives ended before they could begin. Pottery shards painted with scenes of laughter and wine were found beside the mass. If the beauty and the horror had always coexisted, the objects once used for pleasure had become silent witnesses of pain. Each excavation unearthed not just artifacts but truth, the unspoken cost of civilization's pride. Scholars wrote papers and books. Museums displayed the findings. Butts Ebenton. The language used was cautious, clinical, as though describing something tragic yet distant, not the shattered lives of real people. Few dared to name it for what it was: a systemized, state-supported exploitation that turned women's bodies into currency. And still, the hypocrisy of Athens remains difficult to reconcile. How could a society capable of such intellectual brilliance also sustain such moral blindness? The same hands that sculpted marble gods once struck terrified children into submission. The same mouths that preached virtue and logic once laughed at the screams of the powerless. The same city that celebrated drama as the mirror of the human soul refused to see the souls it destroyed daily. It is not that Athens lacked awareness, it chose to look away. Its culture thrived on contradiction. The worship of beauty beside the desecration of bodies. The praise of wisdom beside the denial of empathy. The celebration of liberty beside the enslavement of women. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy, not just the violence itself, but the comfort with which it was accepted. And yet, even erased, the women's presence endures. In the faded graffiti etched on brothel walls, in the faint handprints found on clay tiles, in the broken bones buried beneath the streets, they remain. Every mark, every scar in the stone is a whisper of defiance. A quiet insistence that they existed, that their pain was real, and that Athens' glory was built upon their silence. Theirs is not a story of weakness but of endurance, of surviving in a world that denied their humanity at every turn. The fact that traces of them still exist after millennia is its own act of resistance. They were not meant to be remembered. Yet here they are, still forcing history to confront its own cruelty. Modern retellings of ancient Greece often sanitize the past, painting Athens as a beacon of enlightenment while ignoring the blood that greased its foundations. Textbooks speak of democracy, philosophy, and art, but skip over the human costs that made them possible. Tourists walk the marble steps of the Acropolis, marveling at its beauty, unaware that the taxes funding those stones came partly from the sale of women and children. The guidebooks call it the cradle of civilization, but for thousands trapped in its shadows, it was a cradle of suffering. The truth is uncomfortable, but history's duty is not to comfort it, is to reveal. To speak of Athens' greatness without acknowledging its brutality is to repeat the same silence that once buried these women's names. And so, their story must be told not as a side note to glory, but as part of it. The brilliance of ancient Greece cannot be separated from its darkness. Every philosopher's dialogue, every triumph of architecture, every play performed in its grand theaters existed alongside unimaginable suffering. To remember these women is to reclaim the missing half of history. The half written not in ink or stone, but in blood. Their voices were stolen, their bodies sold, their lives erased, yet their truth survived in fragments, waiting for someone to listen. We owe them more than pity. We owe them remembrance. Because every civilization that forgets its victims builds its monuments on sand. Today, when we read about Athens and see its ruins glowing under the Mediterranean sun, we must also see the shadows stretching beneath them. And the invisible graves, the bones beneath the beauty. The women who lived and died there are not gone. They are part of the city's soul, woven into its dust. Each step on its streets is a step over the forgotten. Each shining column a silent witness to those whose suffering paid for the stone. Their tragedy was not that they died nameless, but that the world accepted it as normal. And yet, through every fragment recovered, through every scar uncovered by the hands of time, they are speaking again. Their story, once buried under centuries of denial, is rising from the earth. It demands to be heard, because history, no matter how carefully it tries to silence pain, cannot erase truth. And the truth is this: the greatness of Athens was built not only by its thinkers and warriors, but by the countless women whose suffering fueled its prosperity. They were beaten, branded, discarded, but never fully erased. Their silence is na absensid, is enduring. In the ruins of the ancient world, among the stones that once echoed with laughter and cruelty alike, their shadows still whisper the same plea. Remember us.